Well, good morning, International Church of Turin. This is Martin Spadaro, and I'm recording this message in Australia, where it's quite warm. I've got the air conditioning on, and sending greetings to all of you. And as many of you will remember, I was there earlier this year, and so hoping to return soon to be amongst you and worshipping with you. I speak to Paul on a regular basis, and we discuss things and encourage one another. And he's a good man who's pastoring you, and I hope you are kind to him. I've been so impressed with the way you've continued to gather and commit to one another in a very difficult time. You have exceeded expectations, really, in the way you've held together. And I've just been so impressed with that, and I boast about you everywhere. So it's good to be with you, and today I'm bringing you the message. Now, today's talk is taken really in the context of being the last message you will hear in this year. And as you know, this has been one terrible year. And many of us have been worried about this year being sick, worried about our education, worried about our finances, worried about our families being separated. There's been so many griefs associated with 2020 and this coronavirus in particular. And we've all been a little bit worried about things. Even this last week, my daughter was in Sydney and I wasn't sure if she'd be able to make it up to Brisbane for Christmas. And she got in on last Saturday night, and the very next morning the borders closed. So we just got her here and we hadn't seen her for nearly a year. So that's how life is for all of us right now. We don't know what's happening. There's a lot of uncertainty and there's a lot of worry. So I thought I'd talk to you a little bit about worry today, and in fact what we really should be worried about. Let me tell you a little bit about my father. He was 50 years old when I was born, and he was a broken man the whole time I knew him. My father was born in Malta, but he had an Italian father, and my father mostly identified as Italian also. His father, who was from Noto in Sicily, did not take Maltese citizenship. And when the Second World War started, he was rounded up with all the other Italians in Malta and sent off to Italy. And he was never seen by the family again. All of his assets, his businesses, were taken. They were all seized by the British and all made a contribution to the war effort. My father himself was newly married. He was 29 when the war started, and over the next 6 years he had several children, I think about 4 during the war. It was a very difficult time, and his first house in fact was bombed, the house that his father had given him. So he was without his father, without his employment, without his house, with a young family in Malta, which was the most heavily bombed part of Europe during the Second World War. In fact, Malta was under siege by both the Germans and Italians for 2 years. And in that 2 years, there was actually 154 consecutive nights of bombing that took place, which was 3 times longer than the London Blitz. It was the heaviest bombing, in fact, of the whole war. People were devastated, they were shell-shocked, they were nervous. And that's where I think my father got well and truly damaged. After the war, after a few years, I think it was my mother who initiated the decision to go to Australia, because Malta was still in ruins, and they left Malta with 8 children, went to a country they knew nothing about, where I was to be born a few years later. My father entered into a culture, a way of understanding the world that he had no knowledge of. And it was traumatizing even more to what he had already experienced. Now, my father worried all the time. As a kid, I remember him being worried about everything. And he used to tell me that worrying was in his nature. And I think worrying is in our nature. Every one of us tends to worry. And worrying is not necessarily a bad thing. But my father was crippled by it. He was actually a very fearful man. He worried about death. And more than that, as a very strict Catholic, he really worried about hell and purgatory. He worried about it all the time. He spent hours saying the rosary, praying, giving money to the poor, in the hope that he could escape hell. He knew he couldn't escape purgatory. He was afraid of life, he was a shattered man, and he was also afraid of death. So, that was my father. But if I were to ask you, what are you worried about? What worries you? My father was worried about everything. What troubles you right now? As I mentioned, we've had the worst year that most of us can remember in a corporate sense. Of course, some of us would have had worse years in other countries that in Italy or in Australia we know very little about. And I don't want to discount those experiences. But it seems that the world is in a bit of a trauma from this coronavirus. And we've all suffered a little bit. It's certainly not as bad as a world war or a major plague that wipes out 30% of the population. But nonetheless, there has been suffering. People have been worried. In Australia, we actually got the least of it. In fact, I live in a state called Queensland. And in Queensland, we've had about 105 cases of coronavirus. We've had 6 deaths. 6 deaths complete altogether. The average age of those people who died was 85. And yet there is enormous fear here about coronavirus. If somebody in another state or city gets coronavirus, the leaders up here are ready to shut the borders straight away. They are trying to keep the state free of coronavirus. And that's happening right across the country. Other states are doing the same. So our state has been crippled. Businesses have been closed. People have been prevented from seeing their loved ones. A lot of businesses have gone out. And yet there's less people who have died from coronavirus in Queensland than there have been people who have died this year from shark attacks. So you have to wonder if it's an overreaction in Australia. I know that might not be the case in Italy and other places, but certainly in Australia there is a great overreaction. There's a lot of fear. And when I talk to somebody who's older, they immediately say how wonderful it is that the borders are closed, because if we get this disease, we're all going to die. In fact, in Australia, the percentage of deaths is something like 1 in 500 who get coronavirus have died. So it's not huge in Australia. It hasn't been huge. So how does such a fear grip us and change the way we live? In fact, we could say there are many fears that have done this. All of us have fears, and fears are not necessarily bad. Fears can be very healthy and very good. It's good to be afraid of falling off a balcony in a tall building. It's also good to be afraid of being hit by a bus, and that's why you don't stand in front of it when you cross the road. They're healthy fears, they're natural fears, and good fears. But fear can very quickly get out of control and be very destructive. And that's the kind of fear I want to talk about today. The kind of fear that destroys us rather than keeps us alive. And my big question is, what should we be afraid of? And what should we not be afraid of? Now, I'm into my 60s now, and in my time I've seen a number of things, and I've seen a certain pattern, And I don't know if some of you have observed this yet, but I'm old enough to remember life in the 1960s. In the 1960s, everybody was worried about communism. In Europe and in Australia, people were worried about communism because it was still expanding. Russia, the Soviet Union, was still expanding across Europe, and the Soviet Union was certainly, and the communists were certainly coming down towards Australia. They had gone through North Vietnam, South Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia. All these places became communist, and we expected this to continue into Burma, then into Malaysia, then into Singapore, then into Indonesia, and then into Australia. Everybody was afraid of the spread of communism. And people were, the country was shaped by that fear over that decade. So much so that many of our young men were sent off to war and to fight in conflicts in other countries, believing that this was a way to respond to our fear. Then we hit the 1970s, and the 70s were a bit different. The 70s were all about upheaval, but the big issue I can remember from the 70s was population explosion. Everybody believed that the world could not feed the population as it was growing, and that by 1990 there would not be enough food to feed the world. This drove a panic. And in fact, in some countries, you had the introduction of one-child policy and things like that, and there was encouragement for people to not have so many children. That was a major fear at the time. How would the world cope if it reached 5 billion people? And the consensus was that it wouldn't. That was the 70s. Then we came into the 80s, and there was the Cold War. The Cold War was everywhere, even in Australia, but not so bad. In the early 80s, I actually travelled to Italy. It was my first time out of the country. So at the end of 1981, I arrived in Italy and travelled up through to Switzerland. And one of the things I noticed straight away was that people were really fearful of a nuclear war. That the Russians and the Americans were in a standoff position that could result in catastrophic nuclear war at any time. And you could sense it. The Cold War was a fearful time to be alive. People were really scared. That was the 1980s. Then there was the 1990s. In the 1990s, the biggest issues were pollution and the ozone layer. I don't know if you remember this, but the ozone layer was a big deal. The ozone layer was so bad that people actually thought that some countries would become uninhabitable. And when Australia applied to have the Olympics in 2000, people argued that the world couldn't go to Australia because of the hole in the ozone layer. And would hurt, permanently damage world athletes. That's a true story. People were really worried about the ozone layer and, of course, global pollution. Then we hit the 2000s. Well, the big scare at the beginning of the 2000s, of course, was the Y2K bug. Everybody believed that at the turn of the century, that planes would fall out of the sky, that life would not resume, that markets would shut, there'd be global catastrophe. And that came and went as quickly as the turn of a clock on New Year's Day, when nothing at all happened. But that wasn't the only scare of the 2000s. During the 2000s, we had the rise of jihadi terrorism. Terrorism swept the world. And I can remember just recently thinking, will we ever be free of the fear of this kind of terrorism? And in the last 3, 4, 5 years, have you noticed that terrorism has declined and gone way back? The caliphate, it seems, has lost momentum. And whilst you still get the occasional terrorist outburst, it's nothing like what it was 5 or 10 years ago. It seems to have actually pulled back, something that I think would be with us for the rest of our lives, that we would constantly see Islamic terrorism or extremist terrorism in various places as a regular feature of our lives. Of course, in the 1910s, and during this period also, we had to come to terms with global warming. And global warming has been a great threat to the planet. You might remember when people were saying that sea levels would rise 100 metres, that the Arctics, the North Arctic, the poles would no longer have ice on them by the year 2000. I remember that by now we shouldn't have polar bears in the world, and how there should be mass migration based on dispossession of islands that would be submerged. Global warming is a real thing. There's always climate change. But there seemed to be a great panic, a panic that drove people to extraordinary lengths to do things, change economies. We had to reset everything based on global warming. But you see, the threat of it has not actually been as bad. The reality of it has not been as bad as anticipated. And that's the truth. Whilst we could say it's still a problem, we have to say that those early expressions and thoughts about it in the scientific community were largely alarmist. And now what do we have in the 2020s? We have global pandemics. And again, the world is in major panic. And everything is now going into this. We are all going to have to be vaccinated. And we're worried about whether life will ever get back to normal, or if we'll ever be able to greet people with handshakes and kisses. All of these things. So what I've been saying is the world on a regular basis has had something big to worry about. Some great catastrophic event that was going to change the world the way we knew it. And they invariably turned into very little at all. Now there's a verse in Proverbs that says this: "The wicked flee when no one pursues, but the righteous are as bold as a lion." You see, the unregenerate do run from things that don't actually threaten them. They're afraid of things that don't actually exist. They run from things that are not chasing them. And that's so often how I see the world. This is a pattern of alarmism, fear, terror that grips the whole world, reaction, and then it goes and everybody forgets about it. So if we're not to fear these things, what should we truly be afraid of? What should grasp us to be fearful? What is a good and healthy fear? Well, I'm sure you're all familiar with the verse, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom." The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And I think that's true. Like I mentioned before, those who trust in the Lord are as bold as lions. They don't fear as much. Let me tell you what, in fact, we should be afraid of. What the Bible tells us to be afraid of. I understand that today, before this message, you did read through Psalm 2. So let's turn to Psalm 2 for a minute and have a look at what God tells us to be afraid of there. Now, you'll see there in the first part of Psalm 2, the first 3 verses, it talks about the nations conspiring against God, taking a stand against him, saying that they want to throw off his influence and his control. And then if we go into verse 4, it says this: The one enthroned in heaven laughs. The Lord scoffs at them. Then he rebukes them in his anger and terrifies them in his wrath, saying, I have installed my king on Zion, my holy hill. I will proclaim the decree of the Lord. He said to me, You are my son, today I have become your father. Ask of me, and I will make the nations your inheritance, the ends of the earth your possession. You will rule them with an iron scepter, and you will dash them to pieces like pottery. So you see, when God wanted to terrorize the world, what did he do? He installed his son as king, as ruler. You see, the Lord rebukes them in his anger. He terrifies them in his wrath, saying, I have installed my king on Zion, my holy hill. Now, why on earth would the installation of Jesus be the most terrifying thing that God can say? And in fact, it is the most terrifying thing he can say. If you have a look in Revelation chapter 2, for instance, it speaks there in verses 27 to 28 that he has authority over the nations and those with him together, that they will rule with an iron scepter and dash the nations to pieces like pottery, even as it says here in Psalm 2. But there's more to this. In Revelation, we're told this. This is Revelation 6. I watched as he opened the sixth seal. There was a great earthquake. The sun turned black like sackcloth made of goat hair. The whole moon turned blood red, and the stars in the sky fell to earth as figs drop from a fig tree when shaken by a strong wind. The heavens receded like a scroll being wrapped up, and every mountain and island was removed from its place. Then the kings of the earth, the princes, the generals, the rich, the mighty, and everyone else, both slave and free, hid in the caves and among the rocks of the mountains. They called to the mountains and the rocks, Fall on us and hide us from the face of him who sits on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb. For the great day of their wrath has come, and who can withstand it? So the kings of the earth, the generals, the princes, are all crying out to the rocks to squeeze the life out of them, to deliver them from the wrath of the Lamb. And we know who the Lamb is. Now, this is a very interesting concept. It seems that God is calling upon us to be fearful of Christ, to be worried about Jesus. He, in fact, is the judge of all of us. We will all stand before the judgment seat of Christ, each one of us, and will be judged according to what we have said and done. That's the reality. He is the ruler of the earth. He can't be deceived. He can't be bribed. He can't be influenced. There's nothing that we can twist in our system that can twist him. Our background, our family influence, our wealth is of no good to us. He will judge us objectively and rightly. He will also have compassion on those who turn to him. But nonetheless, he is God's agent of terror and the most frightening thing that God can disclose. Some of you might wonder what Revelation is really all about. Let me give you a snapshot, just briefly. Revelation is about the opening of seals. After the introduction and the explanation that we are close to the end, the Apostle John was told or shown a great seal, and nobody could open it except the Lord Jesus Christ. So the seals began to be opened, and with every seal was a great judgment. The destruction of the harvests, the destruction by locusts, the destruction of the stars, the destruction of society. Every one of these seals brought a terrifying and hideous judgment upon the earth that could not withstand it. It gets all the way to the sixth seal and then the seventh seal, which then introduces 7 trumpets. And the 7 trumpets, every one of them, have, again, a violence attached to them. 1/3 of the earth will be slain. 1/3 of the stars will be destroyed. You get this pattern of destruction with every trumpet. And then you come to the last 3. And they are described as the great woes. These are the worst things that can happen. These are the very worst things that can happen. So, let me just turn to that. And you see, you get the first trumpet was hail mixed with fire and blood hurled down to the earth. 1/3 of the earth was burned up. The second angel, something like a huge mountain all ablaze, was thrown into the sea, and the sea was turned to blood, and 1/3 of the living creatures in the sea died. The third angel sounded his trumpet, and a great star blazing like a torch fell from the sky on 1/3 of the rivers and the springs of water. 1/3 of the waters turned bitter, and many people died from the waters that had become bitter. The fourth angel sounded his trumpet, and 1/3 of the sun was struck, and 1/3 of the moon, and 1/3 of the stars, so that 1/3 of them turned dark. As I watched, I heard an eagle that was flying in mid-air call out in a loud voice, "Woe, woe, woe to the inhabitants of the earth, because the trumpet blast's about to be sounded by the other 3 angels." The 5th angel sounded his trumpet, and I saw a star that had fallen from the sky. The star was given the key to the shaft of the abyss. When he opened the abyss, smoke rose from it like the smoke of a giant furnace. The sun and sky were darkened. Locusts came out, scorpions. They were told to destroy the earth, etc. That was the first woe of the last 3 trumpets. Then you have the 6th angel with the 6th trumpet. And he came out, and there was an army. There were 4 angels who had been kept ready for this day. The number of mounted troops I heard was 200 million. The horses and riders I saw in the vision looked like this. Their breastplates were like fiery red, dark blue, yellow, or sulfur. The horses resembled lions in their heads, and out of their mouths came smoke and sulfur. So this huge army is going to sweep across the earth and destroy. And you think, well, what is going to be the final woe? What is going to be the most destructive thing that God can do? And then it proceeds. And it doesn't get there straight away. It goes through chapter 10, talks about what's about to take place. And then chapter 11 talks about the 2 witnesses who died in Jerusalem. Then we come to the 7th trumpet. And this is what it says. And this you read this morning, I hope. The 7th angel sounded his trumpet, and there were loud voices in heaven which said, "The kingdom of the world has become the kingdom of our Lord and of his Christ, and he will reign forever and ever." That's it. That's the greatest judgment, that Jesus is appointed to reign forever and ever. Goes on to say that the 24 elders who were seated around the thrones of God worshipped him, saying, "We give thanks to you, Lord God Almighty, the one who is, who was, and who was, because you have taken your great power and have begun to reign. The nations were angry, and your wrath has come. The time has come for judging the dead, and for rewarding your servants, the prophets, and your saints, and those who reverence your name. So the wrath of God is expressed in Jesus Christ. You see, now this is the interesting thing. The Bible seems to suggest that we should fear Jesus. But the world doesn't fear Jesus. It doesn't fear Jesus at all. It blasphemes him. Every one of these leaders you ever hear speaking in private are using the Lord's name. They don't fear him at all. They fear global warming. They fear coronavirus. They fear political unrest. They fear black masked rioters in their streets. They fear economic downturns or the share market crashing. That's what they fear. But they don't fear Jesus. But we who are wise have come to understand that we must fear God and we must fear Jesus. Jesus, in fact, said to the disciples, "Do not be afraid of those who can kill the body, but not kill the soul. Rather, be afraid of the one who can destroy both soul and body in hell." That's the one who we should be afraid of. And that one is Jesus Christ, who has been given all authority. He is the Lord. He is the Lord. I had a wonderful thought yesterday at our Christmas service. And, reading in Luke's Gospel, and you'll remember in Luke's Gospel there was the shepherds who were in the field. And an angel appeared to the shepherds in the field, and they were terrified. They were terrified of this angel. And he said, "Don't be afraid. I've come with good tidings. For to you a Saviour has been born. He is the Lord of the line of David." And then there was a great host of angels in the sky. A great host of angels in the sky that they saw. So one angel was terrifying. Imagine when they saw them all. But the interesting thing is here, and something we might not notice, but the word host is the word for army. This is an army of angels. An army of angels. And do you know why they were there that day? They were there to marvel